everybody, it's your boy Big Dave. Welcome back to another episode of Culture Dads, Age of Sword and Set, where two based publishing dads do deep dives into retro pop culture for folkish and dissident minds. Without further ado, Mr. Mike's with me, and we have a special guest, Hwitgeard. What's up, fellas?
I'm doing well, Dave. How about yourself?
I am doing great. Just got done jamming to some old school doom metal.
Nice. What in particular?
I was jamming Grand Magus. I was jamming, obviously I was jamming some Sabbath, some Candlemass. I had some Pentagram going. I was just going through the playlist, bub.
Fuck yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So we have a good friend and a fellow that we both admire mutually in the chat with us here. We have Hwitgeard. First of all, I guess I should ask first, how do you pronounce it? Is it Hwitgeard?
Yeah, it's Hwitgeard. Essentially,
Okay.
It just means white yard or white enclosure in Old English.
Right. Excellent. So for those that are not familiar with him, you have seen, well, you've heard this gentleman around the scene. If you are familiar with Dan from Wilkinsman as the Fergan, I believe, did you talk to Academic Agent as well?
Yes, did a talk with Academic Agent, a talk with Pox Populi, and a talk with Nick Stilby for Countercurrents.
Right. So Hwitgeard is a man about town and just general all-around knowledgeable guy in our scene. So definitely follow him on Telegram. We'll post a link in the description. But what we're going to talk about today is the sort of general intersection between language and culture. Because this is a topic of hot debate in the world of linguistics, and it's just an interesting topic in general. And I wanted to invite Hwitgeard on because he is a fellow bilinguist or multilinguist. I don't know, maybe no more than two languages. And I thought that he would be able to sort of he'd be able to hold up the Germanic side of the coin. I myself have a background in Latin and a little bit of Greek, like not even really enough to read, but just sort of getting into it. Started to learn German, but I'm not quite there yet. So yeah, basically I can talk a little bit about the Latinate branches, or well, that's the only one that really. That's the earliest branch that still exists. But Hwitgeard can talk a bit about the Germanic side. So I'm just wondering, can you give us a little bit of a background? Let us know a little bit about who you are and why you decided to learn Old English.
Well, I seem to be juggling quite a few languages now, and not just Old English, but it was actually Latin that first sent me on to this path and interest of linguistics. I could speak some basic French after I finished school. And then I decided to teach myself Latin when I wanted to study classical civilization at university. So I learned some basic Latin beforehand. And then at university, I went into doing intermediate and then advanced Latin and some ancient Greek as well. And that was the first time that it broke down grammar into a very concise and almost mathematical structure that made language interesting, because when English is your native language, you do kind of take your own language for granted. And even when you get taught the basics of grammar in school, you still don't really take a thorough interest in it. But Latin was the first step in making language fun and interesting and really breaking down the structure of a language and making it exciting and almost like a sort of puzzle to try and solve. And then that sent me down into other languages. So I started to teach myself Old English, and then learned some German, some Dutch, Norwegian, which I can speak well enough to get by in Norway now. Some Swedish and Danish. I tried to learn Frisian as well, which is quite difficult, but I taught myself Dutch in order to help improve Frisian, and that's a sister language to English. So it helped to come full circle and to bring Old English into a lot more of the foreground after learning Frisian as well. So Yeah, the Latin side was a good path for me, but then it set me onto the Germanic side, and I've just been going down that path ever since.
Yeah, definitely. Latin it's very interesting for English speakers because, of course, both English and Latin are Indo-European languages, but there's an incredible amount of variety within that language family. I mean, it's 2/3 of the people alive today speak that language, or that language family. So there's quite a bit of variety. Latin is a language where the word order doesn't matter. So basically, you can put words in any order, whereas in English, you can't really do that. Like if you say, the dog bites the man, that means something different than the man bites the dog. It's the word order that tells you what's going on in the sentence in English, whereas in Latin, that's not the case. You have word endings and case forms that let you know how that works. So it's very different in English for an English speaker to start learning Latin and to grasp it. There are basically two sort of methods generally for learning languages, whatever language it is. There's the grammar translation method, which it sounds like that's what you took in university, which makes sense. Which basically sort of breaks it down into a set of rules that you learn, and then you learn to parse sentences according to those rules. The other method is what you might call the natural method, which is basically it's just learning by reading or learning by immersion, basically. So you learn the language by learning very, very simple sentences, and then obviously you need to know something about what the words mean, but then once you go from there, then you can just start sort of adding complexity and adding more and more and more complexity, and then more words and everything like that, until you've basically learned a language without ever having actually learned what a nominative or an accusative case is or anything like that. So those two approaches, and the grammar translation method definitely sort of puts it into a more structural kind of form. And Latin is sort of renowned for being a supposedly a very logical language, but I think that's more to do with the way that it's taught. So yeah, definitely learning different languages gives you a new perspective on how the mind can sort of construct a thought.
Definitely, and it also tells you about appreciating the role of certain words in a sentence as well, because once you have that particular toolkit and that particular methodology of being able to understand the role of certain words in a language, you pretty much got a useful toolkit that you can apply to any language, and rather than just having to learn the vocabulary and become familiar with it, you have a much more usable and universal toolkit to apply to any new language. As long as you can take that toolkit with you, you can approach new languages with a much more critical and appreciative mindset to be able to understand it.
So yeah. for somebody like for example, for me, right? I'm an American. I grew up in America. You grow up in America, you really don't have a use for a second language, right? You can learn German or Spanish or whatever, French in school, right? But unless you're working with the Amish or you have a job as a landscaper and you're working with Mexicans, you really don't pick up another language. It really has no use. If you pick it up enough after you're done with that job, you kind of lose it. So for me, I'm 35 years old. I've spoke English my whole life, outside of some bad words and some other languages that my family taught me. Which was between Latin and Old English, for somebody like me, which one would be more difficult or more easy to learn, in your opinion?
I would say I think Latin would be more difficult, because Old English being related to English, the structure of the language is a little closer. I mean, I don't know Old English, but I know something about it and how it gets put together. I mean, Hwitgeard will probably have a more nuanced answer to this, but yeah, Latin is very different in the way that it kind of gets put together. With my experience, I started out learning Latin where I learned it from a textbook called Hwilocks, and then I basically plowed all the way through Hwilocks and found that I still couldn't really read the language, because I didn't. I mean, it's a good it's a good course, but it doesn't really give you enough reading. So then I got a book called Lingua Latina. And this is one that's more of the natural method. It doesn't actually have, like Lingua Latina as an instructional manual, does not have a single word of English in it. It's all Latin. And it starts out with the most basic of all, like imaginable Latin sentence. And then it just builds up from there kind of thing. So it's all reading. And yeah, I basically went through like probably about a year and a half worth of just like studying on my own. And I still could not really, I mean, I could read Latin, but it took me forever, and I'd have to sort of like sit down and figure it out like it's a crossword puzzle or something like that. I expect that it's not like that with Old English, because having learned a little bit of German, like enough to kind of like read a little bit in German, Old English seems very close to German, and that was much easier for me than Latin. But Hwitgeard, what would you say? Which one's the easier one?
I would say both are equally as difficult and easy in their own different way. Old English is a lot more, it's like Latin would have been contemporary with Proto-Germanic, and that has a whole different level of being archaic in comparison to the later Germanic languages. But compared to the sort of second phase down the line, so languages like Old English should be like historically comparable with things like Koine Greek and Vulgar Latin around that sort of time period. So around that, those sort of rigid forms start to ease off a bit, and it becomes a lot more less structured and less rigid, and a lot more closer to what you'd expect in a modern language. So it's a lot closer to German as a language. But there are so many very strange idioms and many false friends as well, where the meaning has changed from Old English to modern English. And because of that, it can be quite tricky to approach it, expecting something closer to German when you've got something that sits somewhere between both modern and ancient as a language. And because it sits somewhere in between, it has the comforts and difficulties of both.
Yeah, one thing I've that rings true actually, that Old English has got so many like odd little sort of quirks and idioms that it's like something that you just kind of have to learn, and like just by brute repetition. One of the things that people say that's difficult about learning English for the first time, if you're a non-English speaker, like even if you're like a French speaker, but especially if you're like a Mandarin speaker or like an Arabic speaker, something totally unrelated, is that English has an enormous number of irregular forms, like irregular verbs that don't follow the same pattern that like other verbs do. And just basically, like for every rule that English has, there's almost more exceptions to the rule than there are things that conform to it. So basically, what English requires of you is that you learn an enormous amount of just like one-off rules that only apply in this like one situation. And it's just, very, very hard to kind of it's just the what's the word I'm looking for? The barrier to entry is very high. Not to sound like you're a foreigner that like uses the language in like a wonky kind of way.
Yeah, we also have a lot of archaic spellings, and I noticed this when the first time that I heard the Canterbury Tales on audiobook, like somebody that was, could speak Middle English or whatever language that is. And the way that he said it, like a knight, he said, Knicht, it goes on a pilgrimage or whatever. And I'm like, wow, he still spell it that way. No wonder foreigners say it's so funny.
Yeah, no, that's the thing about like when you see something odd in English that like just doesn't make any sense at all. Like especially spellings, but like there's other sort of like grammatical constructions, that's an archaism. And that's basically like that is everywhere in English. There's so many things that are like that. And there's other things too, like little phrasal verbs, like I got up. Like if you actually like look up in a dictionary what the word got means and then what that word up means, like that makes no sense to somebody who like speaks Chinese and is trying to like just use an English to Chinese dictionary. You know what I mean? So it's there is that barrier to entry. And I actually have this wild theory that actually serves a purpose, right? I think what it does is, among other things, it marks out the outsider very clearly. So if you have this very, very high barrier to entry, what it means is that people who are non-native speakers, coming into the language group or whatever, it's very, very difficult for them to not stick out because there's just so many. Like there's a scene in Inglourious Bastards where basically the like Nazi character is interrogating the British officer, and he asks them to, or they like order a beer or whatever, and like the English officer speaks like fluent German and is trying to stay under the radar and like not pass as, like he's trying to pass as German basically. And then he orders the beer. He asks for 3 beers, and at the end of the scene, the guy says, I knew that you were I knew that you were not German because of the way that you held up your fingers. Like instead of holding up your index, middle, and ring finger, he held up his thumb, index, and middle finger kind of thing. So it's like these kind of like little weird ticks that sort of set you off as an outsider. And I think that complex grammatical structures and things like very, very complicated sets of one-off rules and idioms and things like that is like, I think that this is actually an evolved mechanism to basically keep outsiders out from infiltrating the group, especially sort of like at a later stage of like human evolution where it was like, you're above band level society kind of thing where like that could possibly happen. The weird thing about language is that it's almost never optimized for communicative efficiency, right? Like sometimes even efficiency is actually even sacrificed for other things. Like, for example, grammatical gender. In Spanish and French and many other languages, including Old English, I believe, the different nouns have a gender. So in French, the sun is male, le soleil. In German, the sun is female, and it's the reverse for the moon. So this is kind of like, for native English speakers, this is very weird because we do think of the sun as a masculine thing and the moon as a feminine thing, but German speakers think of it exactly the opposite. And you got to ask yourself, what is this doing? Like, what is the point of that? There's an enormous amount of information that you have to memorize of like what noun is what gender and everything like that. And you got to ask yourself, what purpose is that serving? Well, I think one of the purposes it serves is like what I was just saying, is that it kind of marks out the outsider that has to like memorize all these things to not stick out. Grammatical gender is kind of interesting because it also does a few other things. Empirically, there was a study done that I saw a year or two ago that said that grammatical gender actually reinforces gender norms, which is super based. Exactly. So yeah. But anyway, yeah. Basically, what I'm saying here is that this kind of stuff is transparent to us as the native speakers. Like, we just don't realize that English is weird and different and hard to learn and unwieldy, whereas people who are learning it do. And I think it's this, it's like a fish swimming in water. We don't notice the water kind of thing. That is one of the most interesting aspects of language, because clearly it is coloring your thinking in some ways.
Yeah, actually, I have a question for Hwitgeard about that. You coloring your thinking. So, I really in my path of heathenry, in my spiritual path, what really like kind of changed me and really gave me a traditional worldview, like in a way that I believe that is more authentic to the tradition, is when I started to try to learn the Edda in Old Norse. When I tried to learn, like, sit down with the Old Norse, translate it, and like learn it myself and begin to try to memorize words in the old language and all of this kind of stuff. Well, This like completely changed everything for me. There was like a key in my head, just unlocked it, and I was like, oh, I kind of get it now. You know what I mean? And that's when I started to understand a more traditional way. Now there was a study a while back, and some people say that it's fugazi or whatever, but there's like this they did this like African tribe, and they're like, here, pick out these colors or whatever. And they could not discern between blue and green because they didn't have a word for green, right? The blue and green were the same thing to them. Mr. Hwitgeard, how do you feel that learning these ancient languages like really shape? Because I think you mentioned about they're going after languages that have gendered stuff in there. I think that they know that if you have gendered language, that is baked into your that shapes your thoughts, right? So they got to get rid of that. Mr. Hwitgeard, how much do you think it benefits somebody that's modern to learn an ancient language? Do you think it really like gives a look into ancient thinking and can help us like heal from the trauma of modernity? How much of that do you just go ahead? How much of that do you think is legit?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. In fact, that's one of the main reasons that I got so deeply into learning Old English. It felt like an escape from modern English. And since modern English has become the global language of commerce, of consumerism and internationalism, it felt like there was no real retreat from that. There was nothing that I could call my own, that I could say, this is my language, this is the language of my ancestry, of my people, that communicates the thoughts and the specific meanings and values that's found in poetry. And going back to Old English, you feel like there's something that you can step away from modern English into. And I'd say that even things like Anglish, that movement to try and create a sort of separate strand of English that only uses Germanic vocabulary, even that can be a form of separation from traditional English. You feel like that there's something that even within your own word hoard, your own vocabulary, there's something that's unique to yourself, and that you're stepping into a particular framework, a particular narrative, but the language almost constrains and envelops. And that by going into that, there's something that you can have some control over in that way. Whereas something that becomes a bit more globalized, like modern English, it's almost like something that's imposed on you rather than something that you are within and have control over. So I'd definitely say that learning an ancient language it gives you a separate frame of reference to find out exactly what's wrong with the language that you speak now in modern English, or rather than what's wrong with it, what could be different, what could be otherwise, and you have that separate frame of reference to compare with.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I am definitely I am an Anglish enjoyer. It's not something that I have myself tried to cultivate really, but when I write, I definitely when I edit the stuff that I write in my second drafts or whatever, I generally get rid of Latinate language. I try to basically pare it back to as much Germanic as I can. Consciously, because basically Germanic language is kind of the root stock of the English language. It's the stuff that sounds very to us, it just sounds basic. To us, it just sounds like what normal people say. Latinate language sounds very technical, very scientific, very impressive, very academic. So those two things are kind of doing different stuff for you, where it's using Latinate language, you will find very often, I find very often in philosophy, this language is used where it's not needed. And it sort of lends a color of profundity to whatever's being said. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you strip that back and you use more Germanic root language, it tends to make it more trustworthy and believable and direct. So It depends what you're trying to do. These are things that we can kind of attend to consciously in our language. It's kind of hard to do that in speech, although I'm sure you can. But certainly you can do that in writing.
Yeah. In fact, the whole thing of learning Latin helps you to realize that many of these very scientific words don't have that particular value that we ascribe to it. Once you learn Latin and find many of these words, they're just exactly the same as you'd use in English, but derived from Latin. There's nothing specifically special or highbrow or unique about these particular Latinate words. It's just that they're derived from Latin, and for speakers of Latin, they would have been just as basic to them as our own native words are to us.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, to a, like, you've got to think, I mean, Latin was understood and spoken by illiterate slaves. So there's nothing special about the language that makes it inherently more intelligent or more impressive or profound. It's just that it has an association. But one thing that is different about Latin is that it was spoken by guys who were almost universally Chads, as opposed to a lot of modern languages. I mean, it's not to disparage, anybody in this room or anybody that's listening or anything like that. But the fact is, Julius Caesar was a pretty impressive guy, and it's very cool to be able to read what he said or what he wrote in like the specific words, like the particular words that he chose. And to understand them in that sense. One thing that I give this like example, like whenever people ask me on streams, like, so why bother learning Latin? Like, it sounds like a lot of work and whatever. Like, is it really worth anything? One of the reasons why I say it is because it kind of forces you to think in the terms that a classical Roman would have thought. So, for example, the example I like to give, this one never gets old, is the mos maiorum, which is translated in English as tradition. This is the basic sort of epistemological or knowledge. This is the highest epistemic authority in their culture, was the mos maiorum. So basically the tradition was effectively what you would point to when you want to win an argument, right? As opposed to now we point to science or we point to logic or something like that. For them, I know. For them, it was tradition, which is way more based. But here's the thing: mos maiorum as a phrase isn't just one word; it's two words, and what it is it's mos, meaning that's custom, and maiorum meaning of the ancestors. So basically, they point to the custom of the ancestors. This is their highest authority. But it gets more interesting than that, because maiorum, which is of the ancestors, is actually not quite of the ancestors. What it means is of the elders, and elders. We get this word maior, meaning major. This is where it comes down to in English. Major connotes better or bigger or greater. Basically, what it means at the same time is the custom of the elders, and it means the custom of your betters. And the connotation here is that an elder is just better. So someone that is your ancestor is your superior, or someone who is your elder is your superior. These are the terms that the Roman would have thought in just automatically without even thinking about it. Would have been completely subconscious and just baked into their assumptions that previous generations were just more authoritative, which is exactly the opposite of what we have now. So you can imagine what kind of an effect that it's not that the language per se creates this belief, it's that the language reinforces the belief and kind of guarantees it just by being stamped in the language. Another interesting idiom that they have is antiquior ei, which is ancient to him. So what they would say when they wanted to say that something was very dear to somebody or something was very, close to the heart, they would say that is ancient for him, which is also very interesting because, what is ancient to us basically means what's irrelevant or like who cares or like, that's just old news or whatever. This is kind of like in our supersessionist and linear history thinking, what's old is basically stupid. For them, what is old is close. What is old and what is ancient is ever present to them. So that's just the way the terms in which they thought. And the last example I'll give, and I think this one's great, is there's actually not really a word for religion. Well, there is a word for religion, but not the specific religion that they had in Rome, in the way that we have a word for Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism or Shinto. What's the name of their religion? Well, they kind of had a name that was really more of a kenning, and the name is parentara. And what it means is, at the same time, your religion, but it also means the duty to avenge your father, which
based.
That's pretty fucking based. Those two things sort of being brought into conjunction, like you could imagine what kind of an effect that would have on a people's thinking. So one of the reasons why I always suggest that people take seriously why you should learn Latin, why you should learn Greek, why you should learn a dead language that like very few other people speak now, is that it will force you to think in terms of people who are way, way better than you, basically.
Yeah. You made 2 points there that like harken back to 2 episodes that we were talking about. You're talking about how like getting rid of the Latinate is important. We talked about this in the Romanticism episode about how the early German Romantics purposely removed the Latinate words because it was like, it was false profundity that it gave it, and they thought that the German words that they used were just as profound. And then in our first episode, we talked about in The Godfather about how when Vito goes back to Sicily and he's like, my father was Antonio Andolini, and he stabbed the guy and got revenge for his father. And then you talked about how important that was to ancient Rome, and that bled through into the Italians and Sicilians of that time, and that was an Indo-European belief. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that these are themes that we've been talking about. But Mr. Hwitgeard, I have a question for you. You mentioned about and this goes into that thread as well, about how these ancient words to the people back then were they were just transparent, but it very much shaped how they believed and how they looked at the world. And today, and Mike made a very important observation there, that we just presuppose progressivism now. If it's like, oh, that's old, that's ancient, that means that it sucks and it's out of date and we should get rid of it. And everybody has this presupposition with everything, like, right? It's like any sort of problem in the world, oh, well, they'll invent something. Oh, well, science is going to science something up and whatever. And it's just, it's really gay. And what I want to ask you, and you mentioned just now, and the last time that you were talking, that you could clean out or recognize what is wrong with your language, meaning what is wrong with modern English. What in modern English is making us gay?
Well, the point that Mike made earlier about constantly being bound to progress, that's one. But I think the fact that when your language seems to put you into a particular worldview, you can't really think outside of that. Well, you can think outside of it, but unless you have an external frame of reference to speak about it, you can't really step outside of it. One thing that's quite interesting that English has unfortunately given up is it's a relationship between the speaker and the external world. There is quite a very individualistic sense in English, as is the case for a lot of Northern European languages. And this is where pronouns are always very important and very explicit in Northern European languages, whereas in comparison to things like Japanese, pronouns are dropped entirely because they're a lot more collectivist and there's no need for using pronouns. But such pronouns are very important to our language. So I'd say the perversion of pronouns is definitely a thing that's affected modern English quite importantly, because those pronouns literally do stand in place for not only describing objects, but the feel of objects as well. The lack of grammatical gender means that we've lost that sort of mystic and spiritual quality about describing the world. And it kind of reduces the world into just, in a Heideggerian sense, about just tools at hand to be used. They just become like mere objects. There's no sort of sense of Dasein or being in the world around us. It just becomes a tool to be used. So I think the loss of gender in that is a problem. But a lot of the changes that happened to English seem to happen during the Middle Ages. And as a result, English had to compensate for many of that, well, much of that. The whole collapse of the case system meant that prepositions had to compensate for that. So rather than having a genuine dative case, you'd use to or for to indicate that you're using dative. And rather than having genitive, the possessive case, most English just uses of instead. So the whole collapse of grammar in English has meant that it's had to overcompensate in other ways. And part of the reason for that whole collapse in English is almost the earliest sign of cosmopolitanism, because English had to communicate with not only the native Celtic speakers, because there wasn't much sign of a compromise between in Old English at all. So you could tell that Old English was quite a dominant language and pretty much just steamrolled over the native British. But when it came to after the Norman invasion, the French influence had just taken over English entirely, and it meant that English had to communicate not only with the old Danish Viking settlers in the land as well, but also with the new wave of French-speaking Normans as well. Mm. So you had all these different languages that English had to try and make sense and communicate with, and in order to make it mutually intelligible to all these different speakers, it had to almost become like a sort of a semi-Creole. It had to simplify itself, and that's part of the problems that globalism has caused for modern English. That globalization results in a simplification of the language to make it intelligible to everyone that it can speak to.
So you mentioned
worse.
I'm sorry. You mentioned there about you mentioned like this collapse and this these two things that changed. You mentioned the dative and the generative, and a lot of folks out there. This is deep language stuff. Is there any way you could give us two examples of how old generative versus new generative, and then old dative versus new dative, so we could hear what it sounds like?
Oh, yeah. I'm trying to think of an example. If you were to say things like, I gave her a book. Mm. In Old English, that would be something like, ich here book, yeah, or ich hier yeah book, which doesn't sound that different. Mm. But there's the whole fact that because it's given to the woman, it's given to her, that has a different function to the book itself. The book itself is an object, but it's not. But the person that you're giving it to, it's giving it to them. So they aren't a direct object; they're an indirect object. And that difference between the direct and indirect objects of people is expressed through the grammar of the word itself in the nouns, in the case system that it has. And in the same with possessive, you'd normally have different forms, much like German has, because it's not all just apostrophe S like modern English has reduced everything to. That's another thing that happened in Middle English, the sort of flattening of the language. So everything becomes standardized, and because of the lack of grammatical gender, almost everything becomes based around the main format of masculine O-stem nouns, which is it just ends in es in Old English, but it's apostrophe s for modern English, and that became the base standard form.
Yeah, the genitive is like one of the only case forms that we still have in modern English. So, I mean, for there's just a lightning round like explanation of what case is for the uninitiated. You can see this in pronouns because pronouns have retained the case system. Basically, what the case system does is it changes the shape of the word in order to indicate what it's doing in the sentence. So, if you say, I want a cookie, that's a properly constructed sentence because the I is what we call the nominative case, which means the subject, I, verb, want, the object, which is the cookie, right? But if you were Cookie Monster, you'd say, me want cookie, which sounds weird and stupid because what you're doing is you're using the wrong case form. Me is the object case form. That's what we call the accusative. So when you say, she loves me, me is the one that's receiving the verb love. So the action is happening to me. That's the accusative. But if me is the one that wants something, me doesn't want anything. I want something. So this is basically like what the case system is. And that has like been retained in pronouns like I and me and you and her and all of that. Because for some reason, pronouns, we could speculate why, are just a very, very archaic form, a very archaic linguistic category. They don't change very easily, which is part of why people get so pissed off about the whole situation with people fucking with our pronouns. So we still have the case system because that's an archaic thing, goes back all the way to Proto-Indo-European. But the rest of pronouns are one thing. Nouns themselves used to all have a case form. So if you have the word book, we just have the word book. That's it, right? Doesn't matter if the book is burning or if you're giving someone the book. The word book doesn't change its form or anything like that. So this used to not be the case. It's like this in Latin. The word book changes depending on what's happening in the sentence, and same with Old English. But in English, it doesn't actually change at all, except in the case of the genitive, which is when usually we use the preposition of to indicate the genitive, which is usually if you possess something or if the noun is somehow being modified by another noun. So the title of the book is the book's title. The book's that term, that specific morphology is what we call the genitive. And we only have really the genitive. I can't think of an example where we still have a dative, the dative being the indirect object. So if I pay money to Dave is like the dative. It's Dave. The money is the thing I pay, and Dave is the indirect object to whom the money is paid, kind of thing.
And that's different than the Old English.
Well, we don't use to or any preposition like that in Old English. We would just say, I pay Dave, and then the money would have like a weird form kind of thing. That's not like the normal form kind of thing. So. Yeah, this is just like that's just a very basic sort of like quick explanation of the case forms. We've lost most of those in English, and it makes for a very different sounding language, very different language. And we've also lost the grammatical gender, like we said before, where the word bridge doesn't have a gender. So we don't think of a bridge as something essentially masculine or essentially feminine, which is kind of interesting because in German, the word for bridge is masculine, and they've done studies on this where sorry, you're right. You're right. Yeah, the German word for bridge is feminine, but in Spanish, say it's masculine. So Germans are more likely to describe the bridge as something that kind of sounds feminine, like it's a beautiful bridge or it's an elegant bridge or something like that. Whereas Spanish are more likely to to describe the bridge as strong or stable or this and that, like more masculine sounding terms. So this has really changed the way that we think about things in the world, because for speakers of languages that have this grammatical gender, those things then take on the archetypal attributes of that gender. And it actually affects the way that people describe things in language. So language is not just a mode of communication. It's also a mode of reinforcing and reproducing culture. I mean, beyond just like telling people things that you need to know. It's also like it reinforces and communicates assumptions as well. So it's very important to attend to our language. And that's part of the reason why, hostile and terrible forces out there are trying to fuck around with our language and change it, and do stuff like Latinx or whatever, as opposed to Latino or Latin. I don't know know how you pronounce that. Nobody who speaks Spanish uses it. So yeah, it's that. This is why they are so careful about enforcing the use of, uses of language that serve them.
Yeah, I have a question. So, one thing that I'm very fascinated with, and I was really started to I'm a big fan of things that theorize time and our perception of time and stuff. And Mike, if you remember during our episode on the Western animation, and when we were talking about the movie Gandahar, you brought up about something that was really fascinating with the one race of people. They're like the deformed or whatever. They speak in a way that has manipulates tense, right? They don't speak in the present. They only speak in the future and in the past or whatever, right? How much of tense has been changed from Old English to modern English?
Surprisingly, not much at all. In the Germanic languages, compared with other Indo-European languages, you still have there's quite a very restrictive form of tense, and that's probably had quite an impact on how we speak of things in poetry. But in Old English, the only in English and German and other Germanic languages, there's only a present tense and a past tense. But then future tenses are sort of constructed with a lot of auxiliary verbs. So whether that's will or shall, or even the construction of I'm going to, and then using the verb after that. But so there's only two tense forms in which the past tense was very important, because as Mike mentioned earlier about how important the past was for Romans, it was very similar for the Germanic people as well, to speak of the past, especially in how that past influences the present. But the future just seemed unwritten.
Are there any languages that use a future tense? And are there other languages that don't have the tense forms that we have? Like, is there something unique about the way that we use tense?
Well, sorry, go ahead.
A lot of Aboriginal languages and a lot of Amerindian and Canadian First People languages. They speak in what is considered to be timeless, or at least their frames of reference are considered to be timeless. And I remember there's the infamous study that Whorf of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis mentioned with the Hopi tribe. And the Hopi were allegedly speaking in a timeless language, although that was later disproven in the 1970s, I think. But even though they didn't, it's not that they didn't see time at all, but their all their frames of references seem to not speak within time, and then you seem to have a sort of a disjunct then between empirical statements, which is what they know about time, and ontological statements, which is that the time literally does not exist for them. But how they reference the world, what they prioritize, what they deem to be necessary in their daily speaking about the world, that's where time plays a huge factor.
Well, this is what's interesting about languages, and we could give examples in English where the language forces you to pay attention to certain things and forces other things to be more invisible, maybe not totally invisible. So, for example, English has a very rich syntactical structure that attends to time. Whereas other languages like Mandarin Chinese, very much less so. So English has, I believe, well, it's got 3 basic tenses, and I think it's actually got 6 like total tenses to deal with time. And then it's got 2 aspects to deal with time. So basically you've got like, let's just stick to the basics. So you've got past, present, and future tense, but you've also got ongoing and completed. So ongoing and completed are what you would consider the aspect that's perfect and imperfect. Well, the other way around. But yeah, so basically you've got these like these 3 basic tenses. So you got either in the past ongoing. So I was walking down the street versus I walked down the street kind of thing, right? And yep. I guess present. I don't think there's such a thing as present completed because it doesn't quite make sense. But yeah, so basically, sorry,
you have a difference between I am going versus I go.
That's actually you're right.
A continual event versus something that's either something a bit more gnomic or a bit more sort of a bit more general, but it does seem to fulfill that same role.
Yeah, so you're right actually that it's like it's very, very complicated the way that like our particular language attends to time. We're very, very worried about time in English, which is kind of interesting, and you could draw inferences on the basis of that. Whereas in other languages, they're not quite as they're not as obsessed with it. And actually, I believe that like Proto-Indo-European is believed to also be very, very concerned with time as well. Even in English, well, not in English. In Latin, you actually have like imperative verbs. So if somebody's commanding you to do something, generally commands kind of flatten out time because certainly you can't command someone to do something in the past. And commands are basically, for the most part, present in time. So you're commanding someone to do something now, sort of thing. But in Latin, it actually there's a future command as well. Anyway, this is all to say that like languages deal with time differently, and you can really see in their idioms kind of how it actually they think differently. So in English, we say things like back in time, or I'm looking forward to it, or so on and so forth. Basically, English believes that time has a directionality in terms of like, for the most part, it's a progress sort of oriented worldview, which is kind of gay. But the Chinese, on the other hand, when they want to say the word last week, they say above week, or next week is below week. So for them, the past is higher, and the movement of time is a descent from high to low kind of thing. So that's a little bit different, and you can see how the Chinese themselves are very they're a very conservative people that in some ways, sort of like the Romans, very much like venerating the past. They've maintained their ancestral ways a lot more, so this might have something to do with it. And also in English, time is kind of thought of as a resource. Like we say that time is money, right? And even the words that we use to describe what you do with time are sort of mercantile. So you can spend time, you can waste time, you can buy time, you can save time. All of these things sort of like make time out to be a kind of resource that is not the way that people think about it in other languages. So yeah, definitely the way that we speak and the phrases that we use kind of enshrine these ideas. Maybe they generate them, maybe they don't, but they at least reinforce them.
Yeah, there's quite a spatial aspect to how we view that sense of progress. It's almost like that sort of semiotic structure in how we view the world in a spatial way. But In English, we tend to see progress in the same way that we see reading as well. So that would go from left to right. And for an Arabic speaker, they'd see progress as going from right to left. And in the same way, that's structure for a Mandarin speaker would go from top to bottom. So there's a sort of how we read as well tends to be impacted by the same way that we view the direction of our progress and time moving.
You know, that was interesting what you brought up about the Chinese, how they say like they don't say like time is forward or whatever, they say time is above. You know, Spengler, and when he was talking about the civilizations, he brought up, what did he say? He said the prime symbol of the Chinese is the world around is approached as a hither and thither wandering, right?
Yeah.
Saying that they don't really see forward and back. Everything is just kind of like this like aimless wander, right? And he attributed that Chinese explorer that kind of like went around Africa and was like, all right, I'll go home, and like that never finished where he was going. And then the Chinese are like, oh wow, big deal, who gives a shit? Like that was like going out and going forward is just not a big deal to them. They kind of view the world, and this, I guess, this is in their language too, like time is above, like it's in this kind of celestial space that you don't really need to go anywhere. It's just kind of this wandering kind of thing. So that's interesting.
Yeah. But another thing that's quite interesting with that is that you have things that are quite relative to you, and that it's quite centered around us as well. So how we see progress happening, we're definitely involved in that. But you get some languages, like there's a Aboriginal tribe called the Gugu Yanither, and they don't seem to speak of objects as being saying on my left or on my right. Instead, they seem to speak in terms of like a cardinal direction. So they'd say it's to the north or it's to the east. So they seem to describe objects as being independent to themselves, as if they're separate to things. And I did find that quite interesting. But it also reminded me of something that we seem to have lost in Old English, bringing it back around to that as well, is the how passive things tend to be seen for the Anglo-Saxon speaker and mind as well. For them, a lot of other things like having an idea came external to them. So there's a line in Beowulf. It's in the first section, actually, in the construction of Herot. And it's Meon Mordeberan, which is, to me, a mood or a thought, beran. So it's literally that a particular mental state ran physically to them. And a lot of statements as well, but you still get in the sort of Shakespearean methinks. You had two different verbs that seem to merge in English, which was thenken and thunken. And they seem to both merge into think. But one was to think mentally, but the other one is to for something to seem to you, in which case that verb is used in a passive way. So you would say methinks, or in Old English, methunketh. And for that, it means that something appears to you. So the verb itself is used in a passive way, where you're the object of that particular verb. And in general, in Old English, a lot of phrases were that would be passive in modern English, like I was killed. You'd say something like man me quelleth, man me quellede. So you'd say like one killed me, or one did this to me. So they rarely used passive phrases in the same way we do. But there's always a sort of abstract active agent in doing things. And I find that quite interesting for how they would have conceptualized the world in terms of passive and active agency of the world around them.
Yeah, very different. The very kind of like different way of thinking, and in some ways, like the soul of a folk never dies, and in some ways, these things never actually go away. But in other cases, things do kind of change over time. We mentioned about, Dave, you pointed out very astutely that the concept of parentara, the religion of avenging one's father, religion itself being basically avenging one's father, has carried forward into 19th century Sicilian life, right? So that's something that has existed for thousands of years and is just part of the folk soul of a people. But other things change over time, especially as it regards language and everything. We've lost the grammatical gender, and that's sort of changed our worldview and everything like that. So, there's a question about how much language shapes thought, or thought shapes language, or it's obviously a dialectic. It's not one way. It couldn't be one way. And this is what you mentioned, Hwitgeard, of the Sapir-Whorf thesis, which is linguistic relativity, basically the idea that language dictates thought. Now, there's a strong thesis saying it does. There's a weak thesis saying, it does to a degree. It influences thought, but it doesn't dictate or shape thought, kind of thing. And this is something that nobody can really defend the strong thesis, because, clearly thought is not dictated by language, because it happens very often that, you're thinking something and you just can't find the word for it. So language is thought is clearly more than language, but certainly language influences thought tremendously. And the idea that language influences thought, or that linguistic relativity, different peoples think in kind of radically different ways, and this has something to do with language, is often cast as a kind of left-wing postmodernist idea. And there is a kind of sense in which it could be considered that. It on the one hand, is this Sapir-Whorf thesis based or not? On the not side of the ledger, you could say, well, it does kind of suggest that people are more like blank slates, that their biology is kind of downstream of the language, like the language kind of dictates their thought or whatever, in the strong thesis. Because, after all, anybody could in principle be raised in any linguistic environment. I think this is what sort of the basic bitch take on Sapir-Whorf is that it's kind of cocky and gay. But on the yes side of the ledger that it's based, we have there was a linguist, like a philosopher of language called John McWhorter, that says that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis of linguistic relativity reinforces prejudice against foreign language speakers, because it suggests they can never quite escape their linguistic categories. And, it reinforces the idea that Germans just all do some things better than Ethiopians, and that Ethiopians can, no matter what they do, never be that good at making Wiener Schnitzel or something. And because the coincidence of native language and native ethnic environment is so high, I think this mostly overcomes, it sort of puts the lie to the idea that linguistic relativity is cringe. For the most part, people who speak German are ethnic Germans. People who speak French are generally ethnic French, although, you've got people in Mauritius and Ivory Coast and stuff like that. And so it reinforces the idea that foreign language speakers are basically inhabit a different world than you. And I think that this is something that is very, it fits very well with a folkish kind of perspective, right? Because the idea that we all view the world basically the same is kind of I don't know. That's it. It's clearly not true, and it's got something to do with biology, but it's also got something to do with language as well.
Yeah.
Why not both?
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring one more thing up to Mr. Hwitgeard, and you mentioned here, and you mentioned that specific quote in Beowulf where they used the word mood, right? And what they mean by mood is something a little bit different than what we understand to be mood, right? We understand mood when we say mood now, we mean like, I'm angry, I'm hungry, I'm pissed off, I'm depressed or whatever. In Lovecraft's supernatural, or was it horror and supernatural literature essay, he has a really famous quote that people don't really understand because he is using this type of definition of mood, this old, and a lot of people describe Lovecraft as a guy that was a man out of his time, like he was part of a bygone age, and because he grew up reading nothing but books and authors that were like centuries before him, and he was kind of a shut-in, so he kind of like popped out. He's like a man of the 1700s popping out in 1920 whatever, you know what I mean? So language has a huge impact on you. Does it completely change what and who you are physically, biologically, as far as your all that stuff? No, it doesn't, but it certainly has a large amount of influence on how you view the world, and Lovecraft would be a big example of this. And what he says in the essay, he's talking about weird fiction as opposed to traditional pulp fiction, and he's talking about how weird fiction is more about atmosphere instead of action. And what he says, the quote is, all that a wonder story, and what he means by wonder story is like a fiction tale. All that a wonder story can ever be is a vivid picture of a certain type of human mood. And what he's describing here is using mood in the very old English sense, that it is a about the human experience, the vibe of, it's not necessarily an individuated internal thing. It's more of an external way that he's using it. Are there certain authors that you read, like, for example, when I started to learn about older languages, and I went back to guys like Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and some of these guys that were, the pulp romantics that were kind of in a sea of modern writers, I learned a greater appreciation for them because of the structure in which they used that they made their sentences, the way that they, kind of the vocabulary that they used, the approach to language that they had seemed like it was like really plucked out of an old time period. And it's really apparent that these guys were familiar. These guys, Lovecraft probably read Beowulf in Old English and understood it and like picked up a lot of these stuff. Do you see this kind of thing in certain authors that have this influence of Old English? Yeah.
Including great writers like Edmund Spenser. He wrote a collection of books called The Fairy Queen. That was like a very long epic poem in many books compiled together. And he was deliberately archaic. In fact, one of the things he used in that was the old prefix that is used for past participle words. I don't know that German does the same, so we did have GE as a prefix. And then ends in a EN at the end, so it differentiated from the infinitive. And you'd have that in Old English as well, which was also used GE, but it was spelt, it was pronounced yeah, with that G turning into a Y sound. And Edmund Spenser kept this in his poems, even though it had long since died, in order to make it seem deliberately archaic. So he'd have words like bespoken or spoken, and beklept or cold, and idon or done, and words like that, just having that Y before the past participle makes it seem deliberately archaic. And there were just like a lot of vocabulary that he used as well, but seemed quite archaic for the 16th century. And he still brought it out and really gave it that ancient feel, even though it was early modern English. And I think Shakespeare is quite similar in that sense as well. Shakespeare seems to differentiate between two different kinds of infinitives. normally in English, the infinitive ending has completely disappeared. So you'd say like to do, but there's no further ending on that. But then when you have these sort of an infinitive that follows the word to as a preposition for it, of a kind of infinitive marker, Shakespeare would keep what was in Old English. These sort of inflected infinitives would have it'd end in an, but it'd have ANNE at the end instead. So you'd say, for example, you had a sentence of he went out to go to the market. You could say he gjorde ut to Chepstow. So he went out to the Chepstow, which is the market, to go. And having that sort of that to infinitive at the end, it gives it separate to what you'd say in sort of I want to go or I should go, because then you've just got like a sort of a raw naked infinitive, and you have this difference between the inflected infinitives and the simple naked infinitive. And Shakespeare kept those sort of very archaic elements in there by having an N on the end of the infinitives. So if you'd say he went to do, you'd say he went to Don in Shakespeare. So he seems to keep that old grammatical difference even in his time.
Yeah, you kind of get that. Like you could say today with the participial, the sort of particle that you attach to the beginning of a verb, you could say it speaks of a good character. Like you could say, this thing about Dave speaks of a good character, or you could also say this thing about Dave bespeaks a good character. And those things mean the same thing. This is sort of like the equivalent in English of that GE prefix that you were talking about in German or Old English.
Yeah.
And it sounds old. Nobody says it bespeaks today, right? Like this is an archaism.
But they should.
But yeah, they should, exactly. These are the kind of things we need to revive. And that's why I unironically kind of like Anglish, the push to like re-Germanize English. But yeah, before we wrap up here, I'll just sort of give an anecdote about how language was a kind of early red pill for me, along with music, actually. One of the things I can trace back to like why I ever became a nationalist, one of the things was that I just loved romantic nationalist classical music. That stuff was just amazing. So it just gave me a bit of a clue that guys like Edvard Grieg and Mussorgsky and Wagner, if these guys can produce beautiful art like this, then there's probably something to nationalism. And another thing in a sort of like related sense that made me think, wow, maybe people used to be smarter and better than us was actually reading, of all things, The Origin of Species, which is, I think, published in 1850, Charles Darwin, of course. Not a great literary masterpiece, but one of the things about it, beyond the fact that it was brilliant, is the language was so different. For somebody that had never read anything probably older than about 1970 before this, except for a tiny bit of Shakespeare in high school, reading Darwin was just like, it was like encountering something that was just way above my level, just in pure linguistic terms. Like, his sentences are very long, very complicated, have a lot of subordinate clauses, all these things that just are way more complex and quite frankly, impressive than English is today, or has been for a very long time now. And this kind of made me think, okay, well, beyond his great ideas, these Victorians were just way fucking smarter than we are. So maybe I should take seriously what they said and what they thought. And that was kind of a little bug in my ear that like eventually kind of wormed its way into becoming something a lot more and taking seriously what people in the past said about like things like politics and morality. So language is very important. It has a lot to do with how we think. And I would very much encourage people to, even if you're in your mid-30s, that's when I started learning Latin, I would recommend it. I think I was about 32 or 33 when I started. It really is never too late if you have the time and the will. And I think it's very, very much worthwhile.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Also, another thing, but I think that for me personally, that language seemed to connect with nationalism for me is just discovering how wonderfully diverse the world is, but not in diverse as in the way that you get from leftists claiming for diversity, but genuine diversity in the world. And language seems to colour the different unique aspects of people's culture. And when you find translated texts, you see, but it has this very familiar aspect in English when it's put into your own language. But then you try to see it in its own original language, or at least you find translations that try to be as authentic to the original language as possible as well. And you just see how different these ways of life and culture are. And then you compare it with the complete flattening and homogenization of the modern world. And you just feel that you don't want all these different traditions, these different ways of life to be mixed and merged together and just lose their unique colouring, their unique ways of life. You want to have these special references that only your language can get, these parts that you find in poetry and that you find in myth, but that seem unique to that culture and way of life. And language is a very important part in that, because it's the means by which these unique aspects of other people and their way of life are given meaning and given life. It shows what they prioritize, and you can tell what's important to a people and how they see the world and how they see themselves. And for me, that's definitely a very important nationalist endeavor.
Yeah, because they are us, we are them.
Yeah, because they are ethnic, we are a people, and our language reflects who we are as well. It shouldn't just be a global language of communication. It should also be something that says exactly who we are. It tells our story and our traditions and our way of life.
Yeah, I don't think it can really be folkish without appreciating the diversity of cultures within the world. Diversity between folk, not within, is kind of more the way to think about it. And just because we're nationalists, just because we're folkish, doesn't mean we have to be chauvinist and hate other cultures. That's fucking gay. So, I think that's a good place to kind of land. So, Hwitgeard, can you tell us about where we can find you?
Well, at the moment, I'm on a Telegram, which is t.me, I think, for a Telegram, and /Hwitgeard, Hwitgeard 3, because it's the third channel I had after previous bans, but it was previously called Hwitgeard. I know Hwitgeard, which is the Old Norse version of Hwitgeard. But if you just search Hwitgeard, Hwitgeard, you'll find it on Telegram. And I've also got a Odyssey and YouTube channel, but I'm still behind on making videos, but I do seem to enjoy a lot more written essays than I do speaking. But I'll probably publish some stuff on Substack soon as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll link you in the description of this podcast when we put it out. So thank you very much for coming on. It's been wonderful to have you. And we'd love to have you again in some capacity. So, Dave, do you have any final thoughts for us?
No, just learn the old languages, man. Learn the old languages, especially for those of us that are folkish. I really encourage folks to learn the prayers, learn the Galders in the old languages, because what this does, the purpose of ritual is for you to transcend time and to exist in a place along with your ancestors, because our ancestors are not different than we are. We are them reborn. So we want to exist in a place along with them because we love them. They love us. We are their children, and they are our authority in this world. So this is why we do ancestor worship. This is the purpose of ritual. So it is very important for us to speak the language of our ancestors and do our best. It's hard. It's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of study and some memorization, but it's totally worth it. It's totally worth it to speak in the tongue that your ancestors spoke in. This is an absolute rejection of modernity is to do this. So, it's just really important to learn the old languages. So that's all I got to say about it. Mr. Mike, would you like me to close it out?
Let's do it.
So, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Culture Dads with Mr. Hwitgeard and my buddy Mike. We'll see you guys again in a week or two. We got another episode lined up for you guys, but if you're not signed up already, go over to imperiumpress.org/podcasts and go check out all of the great podcast content we got lined up over there. You got all the episodes of Culture Dads. You got Imperium Cast. And then if you sign up for the Gumroad, let me tell you, these books that Mike has coming out, these exclusive hardback copy books are absolutely gorgeous relics that you can put on your shelf and you must have. So go over to the Gumroad and sign up. It's not that much money. You're going to love it. But if you want to check out what I'm doing, you can go over to thebizarchives.com and we got a big sale going on right now, $10 and under for the rest of the summer. And then also follow us on Twitter and Telegram at The Bizarre Archives. All right, dads, until next time, I'll see you. Hails and blessings.
Later, boys.